The first one was a mystery, a sad, crumpled little thing, a posy of dried-out roses the color of old blood and dust, lying on the welcome mat my Clara had chosen 40 years ago. Its crimson ribbon, the only vibrant part of it, was tied in a perfect, fussy bow. I remember standing there in my robe, the morning air cool on my ankles, holding my cup of instant coffee and staring down at it. A mistake, I thought. A florist's delivery gone horribly wrong, left on the wrong porch. I picked it up. The stems were brittle, and a few desiccated petals showered down onto the worn wood. With a shrug, I tossed it into the bin under the sink and went about my day, the image of that strange funereal offering fading against the mundane tasks of watering the African violets on the windowsill and filling the bird feeder. But the next Tuesday it happened again. This time it was a clutch of dead tulips, their once proud heads now bowed and papery, the same red ribbon wrapped tight around their throats. A cold finger of unease traced a path down my spine. This was no mistake. Someone was doing this deliberately. I stood on the porch for a long time, looking up and down the street. Maplecrest Drive was asleep, as it always was. Neat, quiet houses with well-tended lawns, a street where the most exciting event was the bi-weekly trash collection. The silence, which I usually found peaceful, felt heavy, watchful. I am not a man prone to paranoia. At 81, I've outlived most of the things that could genuinely frighten me. I've buried my parents, my brother, and my wife. I live alone in the house full of our ghosts, and I have made a certain peace with the quiet. My days have a rhythm. Wake at 6, feed the birds, read the newspaper, work the crossword in ink, a habit Clara called foolishly confident. I read mystery novels, not because I enjoy the thrill, but because I appreciate the order they impose on chaos. By the last page, every loose end is tied up, every motive laid bare. Life is rarely so neat.
The third Tuesday confirmed it as a pattern, a ritual. Dead lilies this time, their large decayed petals splayed like dead stars. The red ribbon was a smear of violence against the dull gray of the porch floor. That's when the first flicker of anger came, hot and sharp beneath my breastbone. This wasn't just a prank, it was a desecration. That porch was Clara's domain. She'd sat there on the swing on summer evenings, shelling peas or just watching the world go by. That mat was the first thing her feet touched when she came home. And now this blight was being deposited there week after week with a chilling regularity. I called the police. A young officer with a kind face and a tired demeanor came to the house. I showed him the latest bouquet, now residing in my kitchen trash can. I explained the pattern. He took notes on a small pad, his brow furrowed in what I hoped was professional concern. "And there's no note? No communication of any kind?" he asked. "Nothing. Just the dead flowers and the ribbon." "Any disputes with neighbors, family members who might hold a grudge?" "My wife passed 8 years ago," I said, the words still feeling like stones in my mouth. "We had no children. I mind my own business. I feed the birds." He nodded, snapping his pad shut. "Well, Mr. Walker, it's not technically a crime. It's creepy, I'll give you that, but it's not trespassing if it's on the porch. And it's not threatening in a way the law recognizes. It's just odd. Probably some kids. They'll get bored and move on. I wanted to argue, to tell him that the precision of it, the consistency, felt nothing like the chaotic mischief of children. It felt personal. But I just thanked him and showed him out, watching his cruiser pull away from the curb, taking my hope for a simple solution with it. The Tuesdays stacked up. Weeks bled into months, and months into a year, and then another. The dead flowers became a macabre part of my calendar. Roses, tulips, lilies, carnations, daisies, all rendered into brittle echoes of themselves. The season never changed the type. It was always a random, wilted species. The only constant was the Tuesday morning and the red ribbon. My initial anger cooled, replaced with a low, simmering obsession. I started dreaming about them, visions of crumbling petals cascading down in an endless shower. I found myself waking before dawn on Tuesdays, peering through the blinds into the pre-dawn gloom, hoping to catch a glimpse of my silent benefactor. But the street was always empty. I am a patient man. Patience is the currency of the old. We have less future to rush toward, so we learn to wait. I waited. I tended my house, my birds, my routines. But inside, the mystery festered. Who? And more importantly, why? What message was being sent in this language of decay? Was it a reminder of mortality? A mockery of my age, my solitude? The not knowing was a tiny, constant itch in the center of my mind, one I could never quite reach to scratch. After 2 years of it, the character of the silence on Maplecrest Drive changed for me. It was no longer peaceful. It was complicit. The quiet houses now seemed to be keeping a secret from me. The rustling of the maple trees in the wind sounded like conspiratorial whispers. I was living in a ghost story, and I was the only one who could see the ghost. That's when I bought the camera. A small, discreet thing, housed in a black plastic shell meant to look like a doorbell. It was an admission of defeat in a way. The police couldn't help, my vigilance had failed, and so I was resorting to technology, a field I have never fully trusted. My grandson, Ethan, installed it for me during one of his brief, bustling visits. He synced it to my tablet, showing me how to view the live feed and access the recordings. "There you go, Gramps. Now you'll see if it's the boogeyman," he'd said, grinning. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the boogeyman was real, and he delivered dead flora on a weekly schedule. The next Tuesday, I was up at 3:30 a.m., the tablet glowing on my lap in the dark living room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that usually soothed me, but now felt like a countdown. I watched the screen, the view of my porch stark and monochrome in the infrared light. The world on the screen was a ghost world, and I was its sole spectator. At exactly 4:17 a.m., a figure entered the frame. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, dressed in a long, dark coat, the collar turned up against the chill I couldn't feel. A hood was pulled up over his head, and he wore gloves. He moved not with the skittishness of a prankster, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more frightening. He didn't look around, didn't hesitate. He walked straight to my porch, knelt, and placed the weekly offering with the care of a priest performing a rite. In the grainy, greenish footage, I could see the bunch of dead flowers. This time, it looked like orchids. Their intricate structures now collapsed into a brown tangle. He adjusted the position slightly, ensuring it was centered on the mat. Then he stood, turned, and walked out of the frame, his movements smooth and unhurried. He was a ghost in a machine, but he was real, and his reality made my hands go cold. This was no teenager. This was a man on a mission. I saved the recording, my finger trembling on the screen. I had my proof. But all it proved was that I was being hunted by a shadow, and I still had no idea why. I took the footage to the police station the next day. The same young officer was there. Though he looked older now, the weariness settled more permanently around his eyes. He led me to a cluttered desk, and I pulled up the video on my tablet. We watched it together in silence. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "Well, you're right. It's definitely someone," he said, stating the obvious with a frustrating calm. "But my hands are still tied, Mr. Walker. He's not damaging property. He's not making verbal threats. It's on your porch, which is generally considered a public space for these purposes. It's harassment, sure, but it's a very low-level, difficult-to-prove kind. We could have a car drive by on Tuesday mornings, but the chance of them catching him in the act is slim. He'd see the cruiser and just not come." "So what? I just have to live with this?" I heard the strain in my own voice, the frayed edge of 3 years of patience. "I wish I had a better answer for you," he said, and he genuinely looked sorry. "You could try a restraining order, but we'd need to identify him first to serve it. Do you recognize him? The gait? The build? Anything?" I looked at the frozen screen, the hooded figure a stark, anonymous silhouette. I didn't recognize him. He was just a shape, a vessel for my growing dread. "No," I said quietly. "I don't." "I'll file this report," the officer said, typing on his computer. "It adds to the record. If anything escalates, you call us immediately. You hear?" Escalates. The word hung in the air between us. What was the next step after dead flowers? Something worse? Something truly threatening? The thought was a cold stone in my gut.
I drove home. The world outside the car window looking less solid than it had before. The order I clung to, the neat houses, the predictable routine, felt like a thin veneer over a chaos I was only just beginning to perceive. The man in the coat knew where I lived. He knew my habits. He had been conducting his silent, morbid symphony for 3 years, and I was the captive audience. The law, my last bastion of civilized society, had shrugged. So I did what old men are best at. I went back to waiting. But this time, it was a different kind of wait. It was no longer passive. It was the watchful, coiled patience of a trap waiting to be sprung. The camera was my first move. Now it was time for my second. I decided I would meet him, face to face. The plan formed over the next week, a cold, hard knot of resolve in my chest. I would not be a passive recipient any longer. I would not let this phantom dictate the terms of my life from the shadows. I dragged my old Louisville slugger out from the back of the hall closet. The wood was smooth and familiar in my hand, a relic from a time when my body was stronger, my reactions faster. I wouldn't use it, I told myself. It was a prop, a psychological shield, but its weight against the wall was a comfort. The following Tuesday, I did not go to bed. I sat in my worn armchair by the front window. The grandfather clock marked the passage of the hours with its sonorous gongs. 1, 2, 3. I watched the street through a gap in the curtains. The world was painted in shades of blue and black, the street lights casting pools of sickly orange on the pavement.
4 o'clock. My heart was a slow, heavy drum in my chest. Adrenaline, a sensation I hadn't felt in decades, made my fingers tingle. I was an old man, doing a foolish, potentially dangerous thing. But the alternative, another year, another 5 years of this silent torment, was unthinkable. At 4:10, nothing moved. At 4:15, the street was still. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe he's seen the camera. Maybe he knew. Maybe this was the Tuesday he would finally break the pattern. And then, at 4:17, as if summoned by the clock itself, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows between the houses across the street. He was here. He moved with the same unnerving purpose I'd seen on the camera, a steady, gliding walk up the path to my house. In his gloved hand he carried the weekly tribute, a bunch of what looked like dead sunflowers, their large heads bowed in a permanent shame. The red ribbon was a wound around their stems. This was it. My throat was dry. I stood up, my knees protesting, and picked up the baseball bat. I didn't feel like a vengeful hero. I felt like an old, tired man who had been pushed too far. I moved to the front door, my hand resting on the cold brass of the knob. I could hear his footsteps on the porch, a soft, scraping sound. I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pulled the door open. The figure froze, bent over in the act of placing the flowers on the mat. The sudden light from my hallway spilled out onto the porch, illuminating him. For a moment we were both statues, caught in a diorama of the bazaar. I could see the shock in the line of his shoulders. He slowly straightened up, and as he did, his hood fell back. The face it revealed was not that of a stranger. It was Leo Millerson, my neighbor's son.
I knew him. I knew the boy he had been, a quiet, mousy-haired kid who used to mow my lawn for $20 a pop, who always said, "Thank you, sir," and whose mother made him return the lemonade and cookies Clara would set out because she didn't want him to be a bother. That boy was gone. The man before me was in his late 30s, but he looked older. His face was thin, gaunt. The skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His hair was lank, unkempt, and his eyes were the worst part. They were wide, jittery, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks, burning with a feverish intensity. The recognition was a physical blow. Of all the people in the world, why him? What possible grievance could this man, whom I had known since he was a child, hold against me that would manifest in this years-long grotesque ritual? "Leo," I said, my voice raspy with disbelief. The name felt foreign on my tongue. He flinched as if I'd struck him. His gaze darted from my face to the baseball bat in my hand and back again. A tick started under his left eye, a frantic pulsing. "What in God's name are you doing?" I asked, the question pouring out of me, laden with 3 years of confusion and anger. For a long moment he just stared, his mouth working soundlessly. Then the words came out, not shouted,
but spat like drops of acid. "Your wife, she ruined my family."
The words hung in the air between us, senseless. Clara? My Clara, who brought him cookies, who always asked after his mother? The disconnect was so vast, so absolute, that my mind couldn't bridge it. I just stood there, the bat feeling suddenly heavy and useless in my hand. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say. His face twitched again. "The project, the one my father was building, the condos by the river. She led the charge. She got it shut down." His voice was rising, gaining a hysterical edge. "She stood up at every meeting with her petitions and her righteous speeches. She convinced the whole board. It bankrupted him. We lost everything. The business, the house, everything." A memory, distant and hazy, stirred. 30 years ago, a local controversy. A developer wanted to put up a dense complex of condominiums on a pristine stretch of riverbank land. There were environmental concerns, traffic studies. Clara, ever the community advocate, could been on the homeowners association board. She'd believed in preserving the character of the neighborhood, in protecting the green spaces. She'd been passionate, persuasive. It was one of the things I'd loved most about her fire, her conviction. And Leo's father, his name was Robert, I remembered now. Robert Millerson, a contractor. He'd been the one spearheading the project. I had a vague recollection of a loud, bullish man who'd argued fiercely at the town meetings, his face growing red. I remembered Clara coming home afterwards, upset but resolute. "He's cutting corners, Arthur. He doesn't care about the land, only the profit. We can't let him do it." We didn't. The project was blocked, and, according to the gaunt man on my porch, it had destroyed him. "That was 30 years ago," I said, my voice low. "You were a boy." "I was there," he hissed, his body trembling. "I heard them fighting after. I saw my mother cry. We had to move into a tiny apartment. He was never the same after that. He died a bitter man, and it was her fault." The sheer, staggering weight of his obsession settled over me. He had been a child, and he had nurtured this seed of hatred for 3 decades. He had let it fester and grow in the dark corners of his mind until it had twisted into this Tuesday morning pilgrimage of death. He wasn't leaving the flowers for me. He was leaving them for Clara. A weekly reminder of what she had, in his mind, killed. His payback. His justice. I didn't yell. I didn't raise the bat. I just looked at him, at the raw, unhinged pain in his face, and I felt a profound and terrifying pity. This man had been living in a hell of his own making, a hell he had built around a single childhood trauma. And he had chosen to make me its warden. He must have seen something in my face. Not the anger he expected, but something else, something worse for him. Comprehension and pity. It seemed to unman him. He stammered something incoherent, a mangled phrase about never forgetting and making you see. Then he turned and almost ran down the path, his coat flapping behind him like broken wings. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the space where he had vanished. The dead sunflowers lay at my feet. The red ribbons seemed to glow in the hallway light. The mystery was solved. The ghost had a name and a face, but the solution brought no peace. It only opened a deeper, darker chasm. because now I knew, and knowing, I had to decide what to do. The confrontation left me with not a sense of victory, but with a hollow, ringing silence. I picked up the dead sunflowers, their dry, skeletal forms feeling like a mockery of life itself, and carried them inside. I didn't throw them away immediately. I laid them on the kitchen table, next to the fruit bowl, and sat down, staring at them. She ruined my family. The words echoed in the quiet house. I looked around at the life Clara and I had built, the photographs on the walls, our wedding, trips to the coast, Christmases filled with laughter. To me, this house was a museum of love. To Leo, it was the citadel of the enemy. He had been living just a few streets away all this time, stewing in his bitterness, watching me grow old in the house his father had, in a way, helped pay for. The normality of my days, the bird feeding, the crossword puzzles, must have been a constant provocation to him. I thought of Clara. How would she have handled this? She was fierce in her convictions, but she was not cruel. She would have been horrified to know the long, poisoned tale of that civic decision. She would have wanted to talk to Robert Millerson, to explain, to find a compromise. But it was too late for that. Robert was gone, and Clara was gone. It was just me, and the son who blamed her for all the misfortunes of his life. The law had failed me. A direct confrontation had only revealed the depth of his sickness. A restraining order felt like a flimsy piece of paper against a grudge that had been calcifying for 30 years. I could get one. I had his name now. I had the footage. But what would it really do? It would formalize the conflict. It might stop the flowers, but it wouldn't stop the hate. It would just force it underground, where it might fester into something even more dangerous. I felt a profound weariness. I was too old for this, too old for feuds and vendettas. I just wanted peace. I wanted to sit on my porch and remember my wife without the weekly reminder of a dead man's grudge. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I filed for the restraining order. It was granted, and a deputy served it to Leo at his mother's house. I saw him once getting into his car, his shoulders hunched. He didn't look at my house. The following Tuesday came and went without a delivery. The silence felt strange, unnatural. The pattern was broken. I should have felt relieved. A part of me was, but a larger, darker part was not satisfied. The simple cessation of the act was not enough. It felt like a stalemate, not a resolution. He had forced me to live in his twisted narrative for 3 years. He had taken the sacred quiet of my grief and polluted it with his own. He had used the memory of my wife as a weapon. And now he got to just stop? He got to walk away, his point made, his ritual complete, while I was left with the psychic scars? No. The thought emerged not as a hot burst of anger, but as a cold, solid certainty. Justice had not been served. There had been no reckoning. He had confessed his motive, and in doing so, he had handed me the key to his own prison. He lived in the past. He was a curator of a single painful museum exhibit. So I would give him more of the past. I would fill his museum until he drowned in it. My revenge would not be violent. It would not be loud. It would be a quiet, meticulous reflection of his own actions. He had left me dead flowers, symbols of a death he blamed on Clara. I would give him the truth, page by page, document by document. I would give him the past he was so obsessed with.
The next day, I drove to the city archives. It was a place of dust and echoes, of whispers trapped in paper. I spent days there, an old man hunched over a microfiche machine, my back aching. I requested boxes of old records, minutes from the Homeowners Association meetings, filings from the City Council, environmental impact reports from 30 years ago. The staff were helpful, curious about the old man so interested in a decades-old local dispute. I read it all. I read Clara's speeches, her elegant, forceful handwriting in the margins of proposals. I remembered the passion in her voice as she'd practiced them in our living room. And I read the counter-arguments from Robert Millerson. I saw the plans for his condos, and then I found what I was looking for, buried in a supplementary report from a city engineer. Robert Millerson had tried to bypass new environmental regulations concerning the riverbank's stability. His own cost-cutting measures, his own willingness to risk the land for profit, were noted as a primary reason for the project's denial. It wasn't just Clara's persuasion, it was his own negligence. He hadn't been brought down by my wife. He had been brought down by his own greed. I made copies of everything. The HOA meeting transcripts, where Clara's arguments were laid out with devastating logic, the City Council's final ruling, and most importantly, the engineer's report highlighting Robert Millerson's malfeasance. I didn't highlight anything. I didn't add notes. I simply assembled the history, raw and unadorned. I bought a box of plain manila envelopes, and on a Thursday morning, I left the first one on the steps of Leo's mother's house. It contained the minutes from the first HOA meeting where the project was discussed. No note, no explanation, just the cold, hard typeface of history.
I was mirroring him exactly. The anonymous delivery, the weekly timing. But my offerings were not symbols. They were facts. They were the shackles of the reality he had chosen to ignore. The following week, I left the environmental report. The week after, the City Council's final denial. I became a ghost, just as he had been. I would rise before dawn, drive my old sedan a few blocks away, and walk the rest, a shadow in the sleeping neighborhood. I'd place the envelope on the porch and slip away. I never saw him, but I felt him. I felt the weight of my own actions, a cold stone in my belly. This was not who I was. I was a reader of mystery novels, a feeder of birds. I was not a player in a psychological war. But Clara's memory had been attacked, my peace had been stolen. And sometimes the quietest man, when pushed, becomes the most dangerous. A month into my campaign, the silence from his house broke. It was a Tuesday evening. I was reading in my living room when I heard the shouting. It was distant at first, then louder, angrier. I went to the window and peered through the blinds. The lights were on at the Millerson house, and Leo was on the front lawn, waving his arms wildly. His mother was trying to pull him back inside, but he shook her off. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Rage, frustration, a mind coming undone. A small, cold smile touched my lips. It was working. The past I was feeding him was not the sanitized, victim-centric past he cherished. It was the complicated, inconvenient truth, and he was choking on it. The climax came 2 days later. There was a scheduled homeowners association meeting at the community clubhouse. I hadn't been to one in years, but that night I put on a clean shirt and went. I took a seat at the back of the room, shrouded in the shadows. It was the same old routine. Discussions about sidewalk repairs, holiday decorations, the budget for the park. It was mundane, peaceful. And then the doors burst open. Leo stood there, his hair wild, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. In his hand, he clutched a sheaf of papers, my envelopes, my documents. "Lies!" he screamed into the stunned silence. "It was all lies!" He marched to the front of the room, shoving past the current HOA president. He waved the papers over his head. "You all remember my father, Robert Millerson, a good man, driven to ruin by that woman, Clara Walker. And now someone is leaving me this garbage." He slammed the papers down on the table. "Trying to rewrite history, trying to say it was his fault." He ranted for 5 solid minutes. He talked about conspiracies, about the old guard protecting their own, about the lies that had destroyed his family. He was a torrent of incoherent rage, pointing at people in the room, some of whom hadn't even lived here 30 years ago. The room was frozen in a mixture of horror and second-hand embarrassment. People looked at each other, then at the floor, anywhere but at the unraveling man at the front of the room. I just watched. I didn't say a word. I let him drown. He was showing them all, the entire neighborhood, the festering obsession I had lived with for 3 years. He was proving, more effectively than I ever could, that the monster wasn't under his bed. It was in his head. Finally, 2 men from the neighborhood, younger and stronger, gently but firmly took him by the arms and led him out, still shouting about justice and corruption. The door swung shut, cutting off his cries. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the nervous clearing of a throat. The meeting adjourned shortly after, the business of the neighborhood forgotten in the wake of the spectacle. As I walked home, the cool night air on my face, I felt no triumph, only a deep, vast emptiness. It was over. A week later, a for sale sign went up in front of the Millerson house. I heard from a neighbor that Leo's mother had decided to move, to live with her sister in another state. She couldn't bear the shame, the whispers. Leo, I was told, had been admitted to a facility for a rest cure. The flowers had stopped. The war was over. I had held up a mirror, and Leo had seen not the victim he believed himself to be, but the obsessed, broken man he had become. And the reflection had destroyed him. Some people think revenge has to be loud, a thunderclap of violence and fury. But sometimes the quietest revenge is simply holding up a mirror and letting someone drown in their own reflection. I sit on my porch now, on the swing Clara loved. The birds come to the feeder. The silence is peaceful again. But I am different. The man who only read about mysteries has now lived one, and he has learned that the price of peace is sometimes a piece of your own soul. I look at the empty house across the way, and I feel the weight of every single petal.